Hello, this is Niswander, and welcome to the NOWMAN show. Don Randi is a keyboard player. He's a band leader, composer, sideman, and author. He has performed on numerous recordings, unbelievable, as we'll get into, including the famous Wrecking Crew, also a diversity of artists such as the Beach Boys, Linda Ronstadt, Quincy Jones, Cannonball Adderley, Frank Sinatra, Frank Zappa, the WallofSound with Phil Spector, on and on and on. He's played live on stage with Nancy and Frank Sinatra. He's released his own jazz albums, fronted a band called Quest, and he owns the famous club, The Baked Potato, in Studio City, California, that was voted by Los Angeles Magazine as the best jazz club in 2010. He's the author of the book, You've Heard These Hands, From the Wall of Sound to the Wrecking Crew and Other Incredible Stories. Don Randi, thank you for being on the NOWMAN show.
How can I say? It's a charmed life for me, being in the right spot at the right time.
Right, and you certainly were. My goodness gracious, and we got so much to get into, and I think this is only going to be the beginning of our conversation.
I certainly hope so.
Now, let's go back to the very, very beginning, because I know I think about this myself as a musician. When did you first begin to find out about music and what that was?
Well, when I was 5 years old, my father owned a restaurant where most of the acts that worked in the Catskill Mountains, the upstate of New York, were booked out of. And I would hear them rehearse and I'd hear them play. We had an upright piano in the back of the delicatessen, and they would rehearse there, and I would go when they weren't there, and I'd plink around at the piano when I was 5 years old. And my dad said, would you like to have piano lessons? And I said, sure. And we had some wonderful teachers where I lived. And I went fishing.
Wow.
I forgot. And I got back, my dad looked at me, he said, weren't you supposed to do something? I said, oh my gosh, I forgot. But I was 5.5 years old.
Yeah.
In first grade.
Wow.
And I ran over there and I got my piano lesson the first time, my John Thompson book.
Yes.
And, I came back and that was the beginning.
Wow, John Thompson book. Boy, that brings back memories.
Sure.
Wow. So now the piano was an upright piano.
Yep.
What was your first band?
Well, I didn't have a first band till I was much older.
Yeah.
I was studying classical music my whole life, but I had a capability of being able to read music. And a lot of the acts, when they would come up to the Catskills, would use me. So when I was between 15 and 17, I was working 2-3 shows a night.
Really?
They do 3 hotels in one night.
Wow.
They'd go from one hotel, then the next hotel, and that's how it was booked. And it was an interesting way, but in the afternoon I had to rehearse with 3 different bands. But I knew the artists that I was working with, I knew their material better than anyone. So I was the band leader when I was 15, and I also was very short when I was 15. and most of the guys I had to work with were New York pit guys that came up for summer vacation in the Catskills, and this was an extra job they did. And they didn't like me too much, and I had a problem, until they realized that I knew what I was doing, and then they left me alone. But, for 2.5 months of that summer vacation that everybody had from the city, I was working, especially on the weekends, all the time.
As a teenager?
As a teenager.
Wow.
And I was getting $25 a show.
Wow.
So that meant I had $75 a night. And that was an awful lot of money
back then.
Sure it was.
Wow, and your dad was a show business guy too,
yes,
right?
Yes, he was, yeah. He started the first Actors Union in New York. What I admire him more for was during the Depression, he ran the WPA for Roosevelt in New York City.
Really?
And would dole out to actors and musicians and writers. So Dalton Trumbo was his friend, Sinclair Lewis, people that were writing plays and writing stuff. They'd want to get a reading of what was going on, and they'd call my father. And it was like $8 to go in, and he'd get 10 people to come in, or how many of you need, and they would give the playwright a reading of his play. And that kept everybody, at least somebody had some money.
Yes.
And he was the guy they had to go through, and he was very liberal. And so they knew, and he was a great guy. And years later, I remember being in my father's restaurant, and I picked up the telephone, and I said, it's somebody in Hollywood. And my dad knows somebody in Hollywood, and I handed him the phone. They were looking for an actor that he knew It was a certain type that they needed, and these were friends of his that went from New York and now are in California. And he was able to track them down for them, so I got a big kick out of that too. And just recently on the Bill Maher show, Carl Reiner was on.
Yes.
And they're talking about the WPA and all that. And he says, if not, because they were saying too much government regulation and they shouldn't be doing it. And he said, listen, if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't have been able to survive during the Depression years. And he started to explain, and I'm thinking, he's talking about my father, you know, and he doesn't realize it. But that was my dad in the middle of all of that.
So he made a lot of contributions in a very significant way. That what a great influence that was.
But he never looked at it like that.
Yeah.
He just was helping out somebody. That was all. That's what he cared.
Which should come naturally.
Sure. You know.
Now, when you moved to L.A., did that happen like after you were talking about being a teenager playing in the Catskills?
Yes.
There? When did you come to L.A.?
I had a wonderful teacher. His name was Irving Hertz. He was probably one of the greatest pianists, arrangers, composers, and nobody ever knew it. I would say if I was 1/3 the musician this guy was, ever, that's how great he was. And he had it set up for me at Juilliard in New York, NYU, to go to college. That's where I was going to go continue my studies. And I got in so much trouble.
Oh, really?
I
won't ask you about that.
Last year of high school, and my poor mom, they asked her, please take him away.
Oh, really? Wow.
So I got accepted at a school, LA Conservatory of Music.
Oh.
And I came out here, I was 17 years old. This is in 1954. And everybody there was on the GI Bill. They weren't there to party. I came out to have a good time, you know.
Wow.
And they didn't, you know, and I had a really, good for me. I had to toe the line, and I had a great education going to school there. And one thing led to another. To support myself, I worked for California record distributors.
Where was that at?
That was on
Hollywood?
Pico Boulevard and near Western, and it was like they distributed all the East Coast jazz and all the West Coast jazz and a few classical lines too. The guy that owned it was Jack Lewick, great man, great man. And I was the stock boy.
Wow.
And I would hear Miles Davis, and then I'd hear Chet Baker, and then I'd hear Sonny Rollins, and then I'd hear Bob Cooper or Bud Shank. So I had the best of both worlds. And that's all I listened to. And I said, my God, why am I playing classical music, you know? And I started to go to jam sessions and try and play. And I mean, I was a klutz. I couldn't do anything, but I was learning. And I got to listen, and I adapted it. And I got a job. A woman heard me play at her club 4 or 5 times. Her name was Marianne Kirk. She owned a club called, what the heck was the name of it? I can't remember the name. It was at 6th and Manhattan Place. Oh, it was Marianne's Surf Club. That's what it was.
Oh, wow.
It was 1 block before Western Avenue on 6th Street, and right there. And when I first started playing, she had Harry the Hipster, who was a scat guy who did all the early jazz scat stuff. And I went to hear him, and I said, "Whoa, what is this?" And he had a great piano player, and it was terrific. And I got into playing jazz, and then she said, "Would you like to play?" I said, "Sure." She says, "I'll have the piano tuned at least once or twice a week for you." And I said, "Well, thank you very much."
So you became the house
guy. I got the gig there, you know, and not only that, if anybody spoke when we were playing a ballad or something like that, she would walk over and say, "Would you mind playing a little quieter?" Never happened again. That was the first and last time.
How can you be quiet? I mean, unless you're playing like soft jazz.
Not to
or
me. No, she wasn't saying that to me. She would walk over to somebody in the crowd and say, a customer.
Oh, wow.
And say, that gentleman is performing.
Well, yeah, I noticed that back when I first listened to music, people were listening very attentively.
Sure.
You know, and that's really what it's about. I mean, the group King Crimson used to say, "Listen and dance."
Sure.
So listen while you're dancing. So, so when did you first? Now you've been credited, as this book indicates here, with what's called the Wrecking Crew. We've had Danny Tedesco on this show, the director of the great documentary that you're featured in, as well as being part of Phil Spector's Wall of Sound. Let's get into that. When did you first find yourself as a first call musician?
Well, being in the right spot at the right time. He had a saxophone player that booked most of the musicians for him by the name of Steve Douglas. And Steve was a great blues player, but he wanted to play jazz. And when we started doing it, he would come down and sit in with us all the time. And he graduated high school, Fairfax High School in Los Angeles, with Phil.
Yeah.
With
Phil Spector.
Phil Spector.
Yeah.
And Phil had already had a hit record as the Teddy Bears, To Know Him Is to Love Him.
Oh, that's right.
On Dory Records. So that was kind of, he says, Phil is getting ready to record again, and I didn't know Phil. He said Phil Spector, and then he explained, and he's just getting ready to do a number of artists, and he's starting his own label. So, would you like to play? I said, of course I would. Of course, it was me, Al DeLore, Mike Rubini, or Mike Spencer, and there was 4 or 5 piano players because that was part of the Wall of Sound.
Yeah.
But I was one of them. And he and I hit it off immediately. Phil and I got along great, and we became very close friends. Steve Douglas, Phil Spector, myself, and the arranger, Jack Nitschke, we did almost everything together, all the time.
So Jack Nitschke was the arranger.
Was the arranger, right. Great. And his wife, Gracia, was part of the Blossoms.
Oh, wow.
Most people didn't know that. It was Jeannie King, Darlene Love, Fanita, I can't remember, Fanita James, I think, and Gracia Nitschke. They were the Blossoms.
Wow.
And then Gracia eventually stopped doing it so much. And they were incredible vocalese. I mean, there was not, most of that stuff was not written. Phil would play at the piano and say, you sing this, you sing this, you sing this. And that's how the parts were arranged.
Wow.
And they had such incredible ears, such incredible ears. But, wonderful songs.
Do you have any?
He's a Rebel.
Yeah.
That was the first one.
A kinship there.
And that was the Crystals,
The Crystals, yes.
And then we did all the Ronettes, and Ronnie was just a delightful.
And you played piano on the Do Ron
sure.
Ron and all that,
Sure.
and the Be My Baby.
What a lyric.
Yeah.
I met her on a Saturday, the Do Ron Ron.
Yeah, right.
The Do Ron Ron. The Do Ron. And that's a #1 record.
I know, right? I know. It's amazing. I mean, I'm going to read some of the names of the people you worked with.
Oh, sure.
And just so that you can hear them, a certain amount of the volume of your work here all at once. And the people watching also, you may not know how many different artists that Don has worked with. Here we go. Of course, Brian Wilson, Beach Boys, Fifth Dimension, The Association, Glenn Campbell, Harry Nilsson, Del Shannon, Wanda Jackson, Lee Hazelwood, Leonard Cohen, Lou Rawls, Elvis Presley, of course, Phil Spector, The Wall of Sound, Michael Nesmith, The Tubes, Frank and Nancy Sinatra, Neil Diamond, Rake and the Surftones. There's an interesting story, right? Turtles, Duane Eddy, Dean Martin, Rick Nelson, Gene Vincent, Rosemary Clooney, Waylon Jennings, Doris Day, Tim Buckley, Bette Midler, Michelle Phillips, James Brown, Stony Ponies, Linda Ronstadt, Gary Lewis and the Playboys, Leslie Gore, Sonny and Cher, David Axelrod, Jan and Dean, Everly Brothers, Righteous Brothers, Love, Cass Elliot, Monkees, Buffalo Springfield, Laura Nyro, Buck Owens, and Neil Young. That's just to name some of them. How does that make you feel when you hear that?
You left off Ray Peterson.
Ray Peterson, oh yeah.
Corina.
Yes, I'm sure there were many that aren't household names, but they were great.
It's mind-boggling,
Yes.
We didn't look at, all of us that were working, we were supporting our families.
Yes.
We were working so hard, that was what we were there for, but we weren't home.
Yes.
For a period from 1962 almost to 1970, I remember talking with my wife, and we got into an argument, and she turned around, it was over our kids, something was going on with one of my sons. And she says, well, where the hell were you? And I had to shut up, you know, because she had the bulk of it, and although I was making great money and doing a lot of work like that, but I wasn't home that much. Because for me, when I finished my day gigs, most of the time, it would run into the night, but I always worked in nightclubs.
Yes.
I worked just about every place on the Sunset Strip and La Cienega Boulevard.
Wow.
In those days, I opened for one of my favorite artists of all time. His name was Slim Gaylord.
Slim Gaylord?
Gaylord, yeah. He wrote a song called Cement Mixer Putty Putty and a whole bunch of stuff. but he had an incredible style.
Yeah.
And he was famous for him and a bass player, Slim and Slam Stewart and Slim Gaillard. And he was like a mentor to me. I learned so much from just watching him bullshit an audience. Oh my God, he would take that audience and he'd leave his set with $300-400 in tips.
Oh, wow.
And my rhythm section, the drummer and bass player with me, would work with Slim.
Wow.
So he would share the tips with them. So they were making great money. I wasn't.
Oh, wow.
But he really was a great guide, you know, of how to handle an audience and how to recognize what they tend to want to hear. You know, so it was a good lesson learned.
Well,
and I worked
a good musician is also a good listener.
Oh yes.
Right.
He took Downbeat magazine one night and read it for 45 minutes. It was the funniest thing I've ever heard. No,
he was just reading articles.
He was just reading and then telling stories about Miles Davis, about Dizzy, about this one, because that was his era. You know? And I'm sitting there saying, oh my God. And we became good friends. And later on, of all things, he had to go to England to earn a living because there was no gigs in Los Angeles anymore. And guess what? The BBC recognized his talent and came back to the United States and did his special. And I got to be on it. You know, it was such a thrill. And him taking them all over and pointing out where this club used to be, this club used to be here. And he says, and talking about myself. And that always bothered me that the BBC had to do that when he was about as an American jazz player ever, and they didn't recognize it, you know.
Wow.
They do now.
Yes.
But not all the time. Most people, he was a little early for most of those guys because he was before Miles, he was before all that kind of more contemporary jazz.
Do you have any particular stories that you remember from the Wrecking Crew or the WallofSound sessions that stand out as highlights, memorable moments?
Yes, I have. There's a lot of them in my book.
There's a lot of them in your book. By the way, the book is called "You've Heard These Hands from the WallofSound to the Wrecking Crew and Other Incredible Stories." And maybe a story or two that it's not in the book you could share with us?
Well, there's.
Or that is.
I think it's in the book, but we were doing a date for Phil. And Phil gets very intense, and you never do. We never went and did a date with Phil, and it was one take.
Yeah.
It was always 7, 8, 9 hours on the same song.
Yeah.
Till he got it right. And as we're playing, we hear this phone ringing, and Phil says, "What the hell is going on? I hear this phone ringing." And we stop, and then you wouldn't hear it. And we continue a little bit. Now we're getting a little more intense. It's the third hour, fourth hour. The phone was ringing again. And we can't figure out, where is this phone ringing? And we're looking around. There's no phone in the studio. And now it's starting to bother him because he knows he's getting close to start making takes. And what had happened was Hal Blaine had been working at Paramount the day before and asked one of the sound guys to borrow a prop telephone.
Oh, wow.
And he had a prop telephone in his drum case next to his drums.
Oh, wow.
And he'd lifted the head off, the top of the drum case off just enough, and he'd hit the button and it would start ringing. And finally, after about the 5th hour, Phil was screaming, "What the hell is going on?" And he let it ring and ring and ring and ring, and finally we were all looking around, and he pulls the case and picks up the phone. "Yeah, just a second. Phil, it's for you." And of course, the whole place cracked. This was our Gold Star. We were in hysterics because we didn't know where it was coming from. And Phil just had to sit there, you know. That's how we eventually got the name The Wrecking Crew, because we could wreck a date like that.
Oh, wow, yeah. And he was such a perfectionist, probably,
Sure,
right? And
sure.
so, which would mean that he could be the blunt of the joke.
Yeah, and he really knew what he wanted. He was amazing with guitar players, especially.
Yeah.
He would tell one guitar player, "I want you to play it on this fret. Can you put a capo on because I want the open sound out of your guitar?" And he'd go down 3 or 4 guitar players, and some of the greatest. I remember one date I looked over, and there was Howard Roberts, Barney Kessel, Tommy Tedesco, and a young kid by the name of Russ Titleman, who was went to Fairfax High School and was his runner, but he was also a rhythm guitar player. And Russ became one of the biggest producers of all time.
That's right. That's right.
Russ was watching and listening and learning every time he was in that, and a sweetheart. What a great guy. Good man.
So at most, how many piano players were there on the WallofSound?
3 and 4.
Just 3 and 4 usually?
Yes, you know.
When did Leon Russell come into it?
About a year later, you know, when he came to town. Leon would sub for me at my nightclub gig at Sherry's.
Oh, really?
Playing bebop, playing jazz.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
and most people didn't know that he could do that.
Yeah.
I knew that.
Yeah, yeah.
And I used to say, yeah, you're not going to sub for me too many times, you know.
Yeah,
He was a
exactly.
great player.
And well, coming from the South, you know, he had his own distinct style too. I mean,
Well, I think he was from Oklahoma.
yes, Tulsa,
Yeah.
Oklahoma.
Is that
yeah.
South?
Well, that'd be Southwest. I've lived in
Okay,
that area, so yeah, it's considered
Yes,
Southwest, but yeah.
Yeah, and him and David Gates, too, is another one from that same area.
That's right. He's from Tulsa as well,
sure.
and a lot of talented people.
Sure.
The guy that wrote After Midnight, J.J. Cale. He's
Sure.
from that area.
That's
as
right.
Well.
That's right.
Yeah. So now you're talking about Hal Blaine.
Yes.
Obviously, you guys are very close, just like you were with Tommy Tedesco,
Sure.
guitar player. Now, and when the studio gigs kind of dried up, some people started becoming teachers, and some went on the road. Were you one of those guys that went on the road when the studio gigs were?
No,
fewer?
the only time I went on the road was with Nancy Sinatra.
With Nancy Sinatra.
And in the beginning, Hal and I would go out, and we were paid extraordinarily well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And, you know, and Nancy is the best. Nobody will ever come near how gracious she is to musicians. But not only that, she's kind to everybody. She's
Yeah.
got a wonderful, wonderful heart. It can't be matched. And I've
Yeah.
worked for a lot of great people, but it's something special with her. And it was always, is everything okay?
Yeah, yeah.
And we traveled all over the world. At a certain point, Hal didn't want to do it anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
So Billy Strange, who was her conductor,
Yeah.
he kind of bowed out. So she asked me if I would do it, and my deal was only if she used my band, which was always a dynamite band.
Wow,
So
wow.
my band got to go on the road with her,
Yeah.
so to speak. The Quest band would go out with Nancy.
That's fantastic. So I know we've got a lot we want to cover. We're running out of time, but briefly explain some of the jazz bands that you are. Let's talk about your current work right now and what you're doing with.
Well,
with
right
music.
now we're doing an album based on all Beach Boys songs, and it's a
Fantastic.
jazz album. And we're having so much fun doing it because it's easy to play, but the songs, some of them, when you put them in a different vein, Little Surfer Girl as a very slow ballad
Wow.
is just gorgeous. I mean, it
That's
just came out, you know.
fantastic.
We're having so much fun doing it. We're almost finished with it. And we just finished a Christmas album for a guy in Iceland. His name is Geir Olafsson.
Wow.
And he's got a great 22-piece band that he works with up there all the
Excellent.
time. So we go back and forth, and we'll go up there with my band and do concerts with him.
Wow. So Quest goes up there.
Yeah, Quest, the whole
Wow.
band goes, and that's a lot of fun.
Wow.
And for me, I never stopped recording. A lot of the guys did. I mean, I will still get calls. Unfortunately, there's somebody, I figured I went in to do something for a young producer, and he asked me to play this lick that I played on I forget, 50 years ago at least.
Yeah.
And it was H.B. Barnum that was the arranger
Yeah,
on that,
yeah.
you know. I think it was a Little Star.
Yeah.
It was the group, Little. And I didn't know what the hell he was talking about it, but he was smart. He had a 45 player, and he put the record on and had it there for me to listen to.
Wow.
He says, "Here, do you remember?" And I said, "Yes, thank you very much." And it was the same 8th note, 16th note style that I would play on most of Phil Spector's records.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But that he wanted that sound, but he didn't know how to say exactly what it is because he's not a musician.
Right,
But
right.
he heard what he wanted.
Yes, yes.
And he was smart enough to have the record there, which I was glad to do for him.
And you didn't have to be a musician to know what sounds good to you, like Snuff Garrett, you know.
Yeah, sure. Well, you know, I so many of the dates I did,
Yeah.
you have to remember that very few of them, even if they wrote the part out, someone would say, "I don't like what I wrote.
Yeah.
Can you make something up?"
Yes, yes.
And most of the time it was chord sheets. When I did the Linda Ronstadt solo on Sound of a Different Drum, it said Baroque style
Is that what it said on the chart?
on the chart, Baroque style. I think
Really?
Jimmy Bond was
Wow.
the arranger.
Wow.
And he and I worked together all the time. He knew that I knew what he was talking about. They had this beautiful harpsichord, and
Yeah,
I
yeah.
did it, you know.
It's a beautiful song, too.
Great Mike Ness's song, you know.
And you had a lot to do with pulling together Cracklin Rose too,
Oh
right?
yeah,
With Neil Diamond in the studio.
That was so lucky for me.
I loved that song when I was a kid.
Oh,
there's something about it. I love melody. and it
we
just,
did. That's a good story.
Yeah.
Hal and I were brought back into overdub.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there after we did our parts, and I think Tommy Catalano was the producer. And as Hal's walking past me, we're at Sound Recording, Armin Steiner's place in Hollywood. And I said, boy, do I know what to do with this song. And that's all I said, and I'm sitting doodling at the piano.
Yeah.
And Hal goes in, my buddy, and says something to Tommy and to Neil, and Neil comes out, he says, let's go to my house this afternoon. And I got to arrange, I put all the horn parts and string parts on Crackling Rosie, and it was the first #1 record for me that I had arranged.
Wow.
Great song.
And beautiful. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
I have pleasant memories hearing it as a teenager. I got a question for you. Like, I recently saw a clip of Brian Wilson with sitting down with George Martin, and they were talking about God Only Knows. And George Martin was really enamored with it. And Brian Wilson basically said that when Martin asked him about music, he said, where does it come from? And Brian says it comes from a higher place in the mind, and then he said real music comes from the heart. What do you think about that?
I think he's absolutely right. And of all songs that you picked, there's a section of that in the middle where it goes bump, bump, bumpy, bump, ba-da-da-da-da-ba. Brian and I had like a fun argument over that. Actually, you can find this on YouTube, too. We were going back and forth, and I said, Brian, let me play it short. Everybody should play that part short because you had it playing very flowing and pretty. And I talked him into it.
Wow.
And that's how it ended up on the record.
Wow.
The short version. What a great song. Oh, my goodness.
Fantastic song and very well written. So, where can we learn more about your music and your career and the whole Don Randi story?
Well, my book, You've Heard These Hands. I have many, many CDs. They're all available. Amazon does a great job for us. And Amoeba always stocks me, so that's kind of nice. And then I have them wherever we play, a lot of times at the Baked Potato. Incidentally, my son, Justin, is the hard rock Neil Diamond.
Oh, really? Wow.
Oh, yeah, he's got that voice. And
great.
I talk him into doing Crackling Rose and a couple of the other Neil's tunes every once in a while.
Oh, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah.
Love to hear it.
It's fun. It is
and
fun.
Your quest again.
Yes, yeah.
So, and then the most recent album is
It's
called?
Acoustomania. We went into, not far from here, at Firehouse Recording Studios, and just John DePatty, who is a great guitar player, and myself did an acoustic album using their Bosendorf piano.
Wow.
And it's all original tunes on it, too.
And that was done in Pasadena?
In Pasadena, right over here.
Wow.
Great studio.
Wow. And this is the album right here?
Acoustomania.
Acoustomania. Don, this has been great. I think it's only the beginning of our conversation, and thank you so much for being on the Now Man Show. And let's do this again when your album comes out with the Beach Boy covers.
We wrote a song, and this is the title, going to be the title of the album, Brian Makes Me Smile.
That's fantastic. I can't wait.
Oh, yeah, it's fun. Thank you so much for having me here.
My pleasure. And this is Niswander on the Now Man Show with Don Randi.